So this is going to be our last video about plants, and this video will be about Angiosperms, or flowering plants. Now, this last group is actually the largest group of all the plants. It makes up about 80 to 90% of all plants on Earth. And what makes this group different is the presence of flowers and of fruit. So what's the purpose of flowers? So in the last lesson or video, we talked about gymnosperms, and even though they have seeds, the way that they were fertilized was simply by wind. Well, the presence of flowers is actually really important in attracting pollinators. So if you think about, we know that there are flowers that are pollinated by insects, by birds, even some animals like bats, right, can pollinate some types of flowers. So the flowers are actually there to attract pollinators to help carry the pollen right from one plant to another. Now the fruit obviously provides a food source for ecosystems. It is also a good method for dispersing the seeds, right? As organisms eat that fruit and then they drop the seeds, it's a way to propagate that plant. Now I want us to look on this slide and notice the female and male anatomy of this particular flower. So obviously there can be different types of flowers, and we'll talk about that some more later in the lecture. But generally, we will look at that in the female part of the flower, there's something called the pistil, and it includes three parts: the stigma, which is sort of this end portion here, the style, which is sort of the long tube, and then the ovary. Now the ovary then is going to be where the ovule that contains the egg is present. This essentially, the fruit is a ripened ovary, okay, that has the seed, the fertilized egg, inside of it. Now the male portion of this flower is the stamen, and this includes the anther. So right here, this would be where the pollen would be found, and then a filament that basically connects the anther to the rest of the plant. Now there are other portions of this flower. So obviously we have the petals, right? In this case it's a yellow flower with yellow petals. And then these little leaves here, the sepals, if you think about if you've ever seen a rose before it buds, those green leaves that are sort of around the petals would be the sepals. And then we have the receptacle and the stalk. Okay, so the life cycle of an angiosperm is a little more complicated than any of the groups we've looked at thus far. So let's talk through what we really need to understand about this life cycle. So first of all, it's heterosporous, like we saw with the gymnosperms, meaning that there is a male microspore and a female megaspore. Another important thing that I want to point out to you is, in this case, it undergoes something called double fertilization. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in the next slide. But I do want to point out that because it has double fertilization, the pollen grain, which obviously is the male component, actually has something called a generative cell, and this produces two sperm. It still has the pollen tube cell to develop that pollen tube to grow down to fertilize the egg. But we need these two sperm because one's going to fertilize the egg and the other one is going to fertilize an additional cell with two nuclei to become the endospore, which is like the seed food. Now in the megaspore, this is the female version, and the fertilization is going to happen there inside the ovary. Now let's just walk through. If we look over here at the male side, remember the anther is the male version where the pollen is produced. So we have the microspore there that is dividing, and it develops into a pollen grain that has a generative cell, which will become the two sperm, and a tube cell. Now let's go over to the female side and notice that in the ovary, there are multiple ovules, right, which contain the egg. And as you see, it's pretty small, but the egg is here, and we see that there are these two nuclei. Those are the two nuclei that the second sperm is going to fuse with to form the endospore. So we will look at that in detail, but as you see, like before, the pollen grain will land, okay, on the stigma, the grow down so that the sperm can swim, or the sperm can follow and fertilize the egg and the double nuclei. When that happens, what we have is the development of a seed. So we see the embryo in the seed with the endosperm that's formed from the double fertilization enclosed in a seed coat. Now, probably you have all at some point planted a seed to see how it germinates, and then hopefully you had some success and it actually grew into a mature plant. Now, this is a close-up of what double fertilization would look like. So here would be one ovule, right, within that ovary. And you see that as the pollen tube is growing, we have the two sperm. Ultimately, one sperm, as you see, fertilizes, and the other sperm fertilizes the double nucleus, or the cell with the two nuclei. And the product of that is this seed with embryo and endosperm. Now, when we talk about fruit, you probably are picturing an apple or an orange or strawberries. But in biology, when we say fruit, we're actually meaning the product, right, of this ripened ovary. So all of these things pictured here would be considered fruit. So green beans, right, those, if you haven't grown green beans or you haven't seen them growing, they are, there's first a flower, right, and they are the ripened ovary. And then we have squash, bell pepper, a peach, and all of those are fleshy fruit, but we also can have dry fruit like the example shown here of the pecan. Now, within angiosperms, we can have two divisions. One is called monocot and the other dicot or eudicot. And these are named based on something called cotyledons. A cotyledon means embryonic leaf. If you have ever planted seeds, and when you watch that, when it first begins to germinate, the first thing that pops up is either going to have one leaf or two. If it has one, it's a monocot. If it has two, it's a dicot. There are other characteristics that are found in these divisions. So in monocots, we have leaves that have parallel veins, and the flowers, or the parts of the flowers, are typically threefold or sixfold. In the dicots, the leaf is actually going to have a network or a branching pattern, and the flower parts are typically in multiples of 4 or 5. So at the top right is an example of an apple tree. So on the left, you see when it is flowering, right? And then on the right is the fruit, the product of those flowers that were actually fertilized. Now, I wanted to show you what a leaf looks like from an apple tree. So as you see in this leaf, we have like this network or branching veining pattern. So this would be a dicot. Now, we aren't really close enough to count the petals of the flower, but you'll have to trust me. Down here on the left, we see an example. So this down here is similar to maybe the grass that you have in your yard. And this is an example of wheat, okay? So you probably didn't think about grasses as being flowering plants, but they are. This little part, when you let your grass grow too long before you mow it, where we call, when I grew up, my dad called it heading out, right? That's really the flower of the grass. Now, so this would be the fruit, right, of the wheat. Now, these are not showy flowers, so we're not likely to attract pollinators necessarily. So these can be pollinated by wind. But what I really wanted to point out to you was what the leaf looks like for these kinds of plants and grasses. And you notice that the veining is all parallel lines in the leaf. So this one would be a monocot. Now, one other distinguishing characteristic for angiosperms is whether they are monoecious or dioecious. And what that means is whether or not on the same plant they have both the male and female parts or flowers, or if it takes, two different plants, one's male and one's female. So with a monoecious plant, it's going to have both the male and female flowers on the same plant. Now that includes examples of perfect flowers. So in other words, a perfect flower is like the one I showed you in the beginning that has both the male and female parts. But it could still be monoecious if it has a female flower and a separate male flower on the same plant. Now those that are dioecious means you have to actually have two different plants in order for them to fertilize. One plant has the female flower and a separate plant will have the male flower. I'm going to leave you with just a couple of interesting thoughts or examples about plants. And the first at the top is an example of some cacti. So when you look at that cactus, it doesn't look very similar to some of the other plants we've looked at. We don't see leaves like we would normally expect to see. We see these spiny looking things. And that's because it is adapted to the climate in which it exists. So it's very hot and very dry. And it has this type of waxy appearance without the leaves that could lose a lot of water due to the heat. It also can do photosynthesis in the stem, which is not typical for another type of plant. And even maybe more interesting example at the bottom right is the Venus flytrap. So we call these carnivorous plants because they do actually consume insects. Now, they still undergo photosynthesis to produce the carbohydrates or the sugar, but they typically have soil with low nitrogen, and therefore trapping these insects, they actually utilize them to get the nitrogen that they need. So I hope that that was helpful.